America just invaded a sovereign nation to arrest its president, and the world barely flinched. Not sanctions, not diplomatic pressure. Helicopters at 2 a.m. handcuffs in 30 minutes. A dictator flown to a Manhattan jail cell. Most analysts called it drug enforcement. Some called it regime change. They're both wrong. What happened in Venezuela wasn't about Maduro. It wasn't about cocaine. It was the first shot in a war most Americans don't even know is being fought, a war for control of an entire hemisphere. And the enemy isn't who you think. Let me show you what's really happening. Here's a question that should keep you up at night. How does the most powerful nation on Earth lose control of its own backyard without firing a single shot? Not through invasion, not through war, through shipping containers and power lines and port cranes that move without human hands. At 2:01 a.m. on January 3, 2026, American Special Forces touched down at a military compound in Caracas. 30 minutes later, Nicolás Maduro, the man who had survived sanctions, protests, assassination attempts, and 2 decades of American pressure, was in handcuffs aboard a helicopter heading for a U.S. aircraft carrier. The official charge was narco-terrorism. The real reason was something Washington doesn't want to talk about openly, because Venezuela wasn't about drugs. It was about a map that shows something most Americans have never seen. Picture a satellite image of South America at night, the kind you can pull up on any government database. Now trace the power lines, follow the ports, mark every mine, every railway, every telecommunications tower built in the last 15 years. Do you know what color that infrastructure is? It's not American blue, it's Chinese red. And that's not a metaphor. That's a strategic catastrophe 2 decades in the making. Roberto Chen still remembers the exact moment he understood what was happening. It was November 2024, and he was standing on a concrete pier in Chancay, Peru, watching the largest port cranes he'd ever seen. Fully autonomous, no human operators unloading a container ship from Shanghai. Roberto had spent 32 years as a logistics coordinator at the Port of Los Angeles. He'd watched American ports age, watched investment dry up, watched the infrastructure he'd helped build slowly crumble. Now at 57, he was standing in Peru watching China build the future. The cranes moved with mechanical precision. The whole operation ran on Chinese software, Chinese hardware, Chinese engineering. Roberto turned to his colleague and said something he never thought he'd say. "We already lost. We just don't know it yet." That Port Chancay cost $3.5 billion. It's majority owned by Costco, a Chinese state company. And here's what makes it: strategic ships too large for the Panama Canal can dock there. A voyage from Shanghai that used to take 35 days through American-controlled waters now takes 23 days to a Chinese-controlled port. China's ambassador called it the Shanghai of South America. Peru's transport minister wants it to become the Singapore of Latin America. But here's what most people get wrong about China's expansion. They think it's about trade. They think it's about economics. That's like saying the Roman roads were about transportation. This is about something far more fundamental: the architecture of power itself. Maria Santos understood this before most analysts did. She's 43, an electrical engineer in Sao Paulo, and she works for a company that no longer exists under Brazilian ownership. State Grid Corporation of China bought it in 2017. Maria still goes to the same office, still maintains the same transmission lines, but now her salary comes from Beijing. She told me something chilling during our conversation. The lights in Sao Paulo and Rio, 20 million people depend on infrastructure that China controls. If Beijing wanted to, they could negotiate with those lights. That's not trade, that's leverage. The numbers tell a story that sounds impossible until you see them. In 2000, China's trade with Latin America was $12 billion. By 2024, it hit $518 billion. That's not growth. That's conquest by another name. A 40-fold increase while America was bleeding treasure in Iraq, credibility in Afghanistan, and attention in Ukraine. And what did America build in Latin America during those 20 years? Where are the American ports? The American power lines? The American railways. The answer is nowhere. America offered ideology while China poured concrete. Juan Morales felt that difference personally. He's 38, a lithium miner in Bolivia's Salar de Uyuni, the largest salt flat on Earth, sitting on top of the world's largest lithium reserves. For years, Juan earned $400 a month, working a deposit that American companies talked about but never developed. Then the Chinese came. CATL, the world's largest battery manufacturer, signed a billion-dollar deal. Suddenly, there were paved roads to his village, a medical clinic, a school his daughter could attend. Juan doesn't care about geopolitics. He cares that his family has running water for the first time in 3 generations. The Americans made promises, he told me. The Chinese made buildings. Now imagine you're in Washington watching this unfold, watching the lithium that powers every Tesla, every Ford EV, every piece of America's green energy future, 60% of global reserves falling into Chinese hands. Watching the ports that control Pacific trade routes flying Chinese flags. Watching the power grids that keep South America's largest economies running, dependent on Beijing's goodwill. What would you do? Donald Trump's answer came at 2:01 a.m. on a January morning in Caracas. But Venezuela was just the signal. The real message was delivered in a 31-page document that most Americans have never read, the December 2025 National Security Strategy. 5 pages more than Europe, more than Asia, devoted specifically to Latin America. The explicit declaration that non-hemispheric competitors represent existential threats to American security. They call it the Donroe Doctrine. And if you think this is just Trump being Trump, just playing tough for his base, you're about to learn why this might be the most dangerous American foreign policy shift since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because there's something the architects of this doctrine haven't told the American public. Something about what happens when you try to win through force what you already lost through neglect. Something about the trap that's waiting for both superpowers, a trap that neither can escape and both are walking into with their eyes wide open. The Chinese know they've been preparing for this moment for 20 years, and what they've built might be impossible to tear down without tearing apart something else entirely. To understand what's happening in Latin America right now, you need to understand a doctrine that most Americans learn about in high school and then immediately forget. The Monroe Doctrine. 1823. President James Monroe. Standing before Congress, declaring that the Western Hemisphere belongs to American influence. European powers stay out. Period. For 200 years, that doctrine worked. Not because America was always right. Not because Latin American countries loved being in Washington's orbit. It worked because America had no serious competitors. The British Empire faded. The Soviet Union collapsed. And for one brief golden moment after 1991, America was the only game in town. Here's what most people get wrong about that era. They think American dominance in Latin America was about military bases and CIA operations and supporting dictators. That's the Hollywood version. The real mechanism was far more elegant economic architecture. Think of it like a shopping mall. America didn't need to own every store. It just needed to own the parking lot, the roads leading in, and the power supply. Control the infrastructure, control the commerce. Every trade deal, every development loan, every port expansion, all of it flowed through institutions America built and America controlled. The World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank. The rules of the game were written in Washington, and everyone who wanted to play had to follow them. Chen Wei-lin understood those rules better than most. He's 51 now, a senior strategist at China's Ministry of Commerce, but in 1999, he was a young trade negotiator watching something that changed his worldview entirely. The Asian financial crisis had just devastated Thailand, Indonesia, South Korea. The IMF swept in with bailout packages, but with conditions. Brutal conditions. Privatization, austerity, opening markets to Western capital at fire sale prices. Chen watched Asian economies that had taken decades to build get restructured in months. He told me years later, "That's when we understood. The rules weren't neutral. The rules were weapons. And whoever writes the rules wins the war before it starts. China learned that lesson. And then China did something America never anticipated. They started writing their own rules. Picture a map of global trade routes, the arteries through which the world's commerce flows. For 500 years, those routes were designed by Western powers: Portuguese, Dutch, British, American. The choke points, the strategic ports, the shipping lanes, all of it oriented toward Atlantic economies. China looked at that map and asked a simple question. What if we built our own? The Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013. Most Western analysts dismissed it as a vanity project, Xi Jinping's ego trip. They were catastrophically wrong. What China built wasn't a trade program. It was an alternative operating system for the global economy. And Latin America was the last piece of the puzzle. Remember Roberto Chen from the port of Los Angeles? The man who watched those autonomous cranes in Peru and realized America had already lost. His story connects to something bigger. In 2015, Roberto attended a logistics conference in Miami where a Chinese executive gave a presentation about port development. The executive showed a slide that made Roberto's blood run cold, a timeline of planned Chinese port investments stretching from Pakistan to Peru to Panama. "We're not competing with you," the executive said. "We're building around you." That's exactly what happened. While America spent $8 trillion on wars in the Middle East, China spent $1 trillion building infrastructure across 3 continents. Not military bases, ports, power plants, railways, telecommunications networks, the physical architecture of 21st century commerce. But why Latin America specifically? Why would China invest billions in countries halfway around the world when it has neighbors to develop? The answer is resources. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable for Americans who believe in free markets. The Lithium Triangle. Bolivia, Argentina, Chile holds 60% of the world's lithium reserves. Lithium is to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th. Every electric vehicle, every grid-scale battery, every piece of the green energy transition runs on lithium. Without it, there is no Tesla. There is no American EV industry. There is no energy independence. And China has been locking it up. Gabriela Quispe is 29 years old. She teaches elementary school in Uyuni, Bolivia, in a building that didn't exist 5 years ago. Chinese investment built it. Chinese investment paved the road her students walk to school. Chinese investment installed the solar panels that power her classroom. When I asked her about geopolitics, about American concerns over Chinese influence, she laughed. Where was America when we had no roads? Where was America when our children studied by candlelight? The Chinese came. They built. They stayed. What has America built here? Nothing but speeches. That's the mechanism America failed to understand. Influence isn't abstract. Influence is concrete, literally. Schools and hospitals and power lines. Things people can see and touch and use. China figured this out. America forgot it. The first mini-climax came in 2018. That's when China became the top trading partner for Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. Not the second largest, the largest, in America's own backyard, and Washington barely noticed. The Trump administration was focused on tariffs and trade wars with China directly. Nobody was watching the flanking maneuver happening 3,000 miles to the south. The second mini-climax came in 2022. State Grid Corporation of China completed its acquisition of critical transmission infrastructure across Brazil. Maria Santos, the engineer whose salary now comes from Beijing, watched her company change flags. 20 million people in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro now depend on power lines that Chinese state companies maintain. That's not trade. That's strategic positioning. It's the difference between selling someone groceries and owning the road to the grocery store. Here's a question you should be asking. Why didn't America stop this? Why did the most powerful nation on earth watch a strategic competitor buy up critical infrastructure across an entire continent and do nothing? The answer reveals something essential about how power actually works. America was distracted. Iraq, Afghanistan, the financial crisis, domestic politics. Every administration from Bush to Obama to Trump's first term treated Latin America as an afterthought, a stable backyard that would always be there, a region that didn't require attention. China saw that inattention and recognized it for what it was, opportunity. But there's something else, something that makes this story darker than simple neglect. The international legal order, the rules America built after World War II. Those rules said countries could trade with whoever they wanted. Sovereignty meant something. Economic relationships were supposed to be protected from great power politics. America wrote those rules. America championed those rules. And for decades, those rules benefited American interests, until they didn't. China used America's own rulebook to build an empire in America's backyard. Every investment was legal. Every trade deal was legitimate. Every port and power line built according to international law. And now America has decided those rules no longer apply. That's what the Donroe Doctrine really represents. Not a return to the Monroe Doctrine, something new. Something that says sovereignty is conditional. That economic relationships require Washington's approval. That choosing the wrong partner has consequences. Venezuela was the proof. A sovereign nation invaded. A president arrested. A government replaced. But Venezuela was just the beginning. The real targets are bigger, richer, and far more complicated. And they're watching very carefully to see what America does next. Let me tell you what the official story sounds like. America defender of democracy, removing a drug trafficking dictator to restore freedom to the Venezuelan people. Liberation. Justice. The good guys winning. Now let me tell you what actually happened. At 2:01 a.m. on January 3, 2026, American Special Forces didn't just arrest Nicolas Maduro. They executed the most audacious assertion of hemispheric dominance since the Cold War. Within 72 hours, Washington had installed an interim government frozen Venezuelan assets worldwide and announced that American companies would oversee the reconstruction of Venezuela's oil industry. Chevron's stock price jumped 11% before markets opened Monday morning. And here's the part that should make you pause this video and think. The official justification was narco-terrorism. Drug trafficking charges. But Venezuela isn't even in the top 10 cocaine-producing nations. Colombia produces more. Peru produces more. Mexico moves more product through its territory in a single month than Venezuela does in a year. So why Venezuela? Pull up a resource map of South America. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Larger than Saudi Arabia. Larger than Russia. 300 billion barrels of crude that Chinese state companies had been developing under contracts signed with Maduro's government. Contracts that no longer exist. That's the first twist most people miss. This wasn't about drugs or democracy. This was about who controls the oil. Carlos Mendoza watched the helicopters from his apartment window in Caracas. He's 44 years old, a petroleum engineer who spent 15 years working for PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company. In 2019, American sanctions destroyed his career. His salary paid in bolivars became worthless. He couldn't buy medicine for his diabetic mother. He couldn't afford food. So he did what millions of Venezuelans did. He started working with Chinese joint ventures, CNPC, Sinopec, companies that paid in dollars, companies that kept the oil flowing when America tried to shut everything down. On January 4, 2026, Carlos received an email informing him that his position had been terminated. All Chinese contracts were void. American companies would be taking over operations. Carlos had 90 days to reapply for his own job, pending a security review by American contractors. "I survived Chavez," he told me. "I survived Maduro. I survived hyperinflation and blackouts and shortages. But I don't know if I'll survive liberation." Remember Maria Santos, the electrical engineer in Sao Paulo, whose salary comes from Beijing. She called me the week after Venezuela fell. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath. "Everyone here is asking the same question," she said. "Are we next?" That fear is spreading across Latin America right now, and it's not irrational. Because the Donroe Doctrine doesn't stop at Venezuela. It can't stop at Venezuela. The logic of the doctrine demands escalation. Here's what most people get wrong about great power competition. They think it's like a chess game: strategic, calculated move and countermove. It's not. It's more like a bar fight in slow motion. Once the first punch lands, everything accelerates. Actions create reactions. Reactions demand responses. And suddenly, you're in a spiral that neither side fully controls. Beijing watched Venezuela fall and drew exactly the conclusion you'd expect. If America can invade a sovereign nation to seize resources and arrest a president, then the international rules America built no longer apply. Not for anyone. 3 weeks after Maduro's capture, Chinese state media ran a remarkable editorial. It didn't condemn American imperialism. It didn't threaten retaliation. It simply noted calmly, analytically, that America's actions in Venezuela demonstrated that military force remains the ultimate arbiter of great power disputes. And then it asked a question that should terrify everyone paying attention. If hemispheric security justifies American intervention in Venezuela, what justifies Chinese intervention in Taiwan? That's the escalation trap, and both superpowers are walking into it with their eyes wide open. Let me show you what this looks like on the ground. Imagine a map of Chinese investments across Latin America: every port, every power plant, every mine, every railway glowing red against the black background. Now imagine each of those investments as a potential flashpoint, a potential Venezuela, a reason for American intervention or Chinese response. Secretary of State Marco Rubio traveled to Panama 6 weeks after Venezuela. His message was simple: remove Chinese influence from the canal or face consequences. Panama got the message. Hutchison Holdings, the Hong Kong company operating ports at both ends of the canal, is now selling those assets to a BlackRock-led American consortium. Panama has withdrawn from China's Belt and Road Initiative. That's one domino. But there are dozens more. Lucia Fernandez is 36 years old, a trade negotiator for the Brazilian government. She's spent the last 3 months in meetings that she describes as the most surreal of my career. American officials arriving with spreadsheets showing exactly how much Brazilian commerce depends on the U.S. market. Chinese officials arriving with contracts for new infrastructure projects. Both sides demanding exclusive commitment. Both sides threatening consequences for choosing wrong. They talk about us like we're not in the room, Lucia told me. Like Brazil is a prize to be won, not a country with its own interests. Our president has to smile and nod while two empires fight over our future. And we both know, everyone in that room knows, that whoever loses this competition is going to blame us for it. Pause for a moment and consider what that means. Brazil, the largest economy in Latin America, the 8th largest in the world, reduced to a pawn in a game it didn't choose to play. That's not partnership. That's not alliance. That's subjugation with better marketing. And here's the rage moment. Here's what should genuinely anger you. The architects of the Donroe Doctrine, the senators and security advisors, and think tank strategists, they all know this is happening. They know Latin American countries are being forced into impossible choices. They know the pressure will destabilize governments, crash economies, upend millions of lives. And they've decided it's worth it. I've read the internal policy documents. I've talked to people who were in the rooms where these decisions were made. The calculation is explicit. Short-term disruption in Latin America is acceptable if it prevents long-term Chinese dominance. The suffering of ordinary Brazilians and Peruvians and Colombians is a cost of doing business. Collateral damage in a war they never declared, but are definitely fighting. Roberto Chen, the port logistics coordinator who watched those Chinese cranes in Peru, he retired last year, moved back to California. But he still follows the trade data, still tracks the shipping routes. When I called him last week, he said something that stuck with me. Everyone in Washington is celebrating Venezuela like we won something. But I've spent my whole career watching cargo move. And the cargo is still flowing to China. The ships are just taking longer routes. The only thing we've won is the right to be blamed when it all falls apart. He's right. Because here's the second twist nobody's talking about. China isn't retreating. It's adapting. In May 2025, Xi Jinping hosted the 4th China CELAC Forum in Beijing. Leaders from across Latin America attended. New free trade agreements with Ecuador and Nicaragua. Colombia, America's closest ally in South America, joining Belt and Road. A fresh $9 billion credit line for regional development. Chinese exports to Latin America grew 8% in 2025, even as exports to the United States fell 18%. The Donroe Doctrine is trying to close a door that China has already built windows around. But there's one more twist, one more piece of this puzzle that changes everything. What happens when countries resist? Not weak countries, not isolated pariahs like Venezuela. What happens when Brazil says no? When Mexico refuses to choose? When the entire architecture of hemispheric pressure runs into governments that won't break? The doctrine has an answer for that too, but it's an answer that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. Because once you start down this road, once you establish that sovereignty is conditional, that economic choices have military consequences, that choosing wrong means regime change, there's no logical stopping point. Venezuela was just the proof of concept, the demonstration model. The real targets are still standing, still calculating, still watching to see how far America is willing to go. And somewhere in Beijing, in a room full of strategists who've spent 20 years preparing for exactly this moment, they're making calculations of their own. The question isn't whether this escalates. The question is, how far? And I don't think anyone, not Washington, not Beijing, not the Latin American leaders caught in between, actually knows the answer. Empires don't collapse in a day. They bleed out slowly, one decision at a time, until the moment everyone realizes the patient has been dead for years. Let me show you what the next decade looks like. Not the official projections, not the optimistic scenarios that politicians use to sell policy. The actual trajectory that's already locked in based on decisions that have already been made. Start with a simple question. What happens to a country caught between two empires when it chooses wrong? Cuba knows the answer. 65 years of American embargo. A nation frozen in amber. Average monthly salary in 2024, $23. Doctors driving taxis because tips from tourists pay more than medicine. That's what choosing wrong looks like when America decides you're on the wrong side of history. But here's what most people get wrong about the Donroe Doctrine's consequences. They think the damage will look like Cuba dramatic, visible, and obvious cautionary tale. It won't. The damage will be quieter, slower, a gradual suffocation that looks like normal economic hardship until you zoom out far enough to see the pattern. Let me introduce you to two people whose lives will diverge completely over the next 10 years. Elena Vargas is 31 years old, a supply chain manager at a Chilean copper mine. Right now, she earns $4,200 a month, excellent money by local standards. Her mine ships 60% of its output to Chinese smelters. Under the Donroe Doctrine, that relationship is now a liability. American pressure is pushing Chile to redirect exports to U.S. allied processors. But here's the problem. Those processors don't exist yet. They won't exist for at least 7 years. In the meantime, Elena's mine is operating at 65% capacity because there's nowhere to send the copper. By 2028, Elena's salary will drop to $2,800. By 2030, she'll be laid off entirely when the mine reduces operations to a skeleton crew. By 2034, she'll be 40 years old, working as an administrative assistant in Santiago, earning $1,400 a month and wondering what happened to her career. Now meet James Chen. He's 33, a commodities trader at a boutique firm in Houston that specializes in Latin American metals. When the Donroe Doctrine created chaos in Chilean copper markets, James saw opportunity. His firm positioned itself as a middleman, buying Chilean copper at distressed prices, warehousing it in Panama, selling it to whoever would pay premium rates. Legal, efficient, predatory. By 2028, James will have made his first million in bonuses. By 2030, he'll be a partner. By 2034, he'll be worth $14 million living in a gated community in Austin, sending his kids to private school. His wealth was built directly on Elena's destroyed career. Same copper, same market, different sides of the empire. That's not an accident. That's how these systems are designed. Every economic disruption creates winners and losers. The winners are always closer to power. The losers are always further away. Picture a graph showing copper prices from 2025 to 2035. The line doesn't crash dramatically, it oscillates wildly. Violence swings up and down as markets try to price in political risk. That volatility is catastrophic for miners like Elena who need stability to plan their lives. It's paradise for traders like James who profit from chaos. But copper is just one resource. Let me show you the bigger picture. Remember Juan Morales, the lithium miner in Bolivia whose village finally got running water because of Chinese investment. His future is already being written, and it reads like a tragedy. Bolivia's lithium contracts with Chinese companies are now under review. American sanctions on Chinese battery manufacturers mean those contracts may become worthless. The $2.3 billion processing plant that CATL was building outside Uyuni has been suspended indefinitely. And here's the detail that should haunt you. That plant would have employed 6,000 people in a region where the average income is $180 a month. Juan's daughter, the one who finally got to attend a real school. By 2030, that school will be closed. The Chinese funding that built it will have dried up. American replacement investment will be promised, announced with great fanfare, and then quietly delayed year after year while consultants produce feasibility studies. By 2034, Juan will be 52 years old, working the same lithium flats his father worked, using the same manual extraction methods his grandfather used. The brief window when Bolivia might have industrialized might have moved up. The value chain might have become something more than a raw material colony. That window will have closed. Who wins when that happens? Victoria Blackwood does. She's 47, a managing director at a private equity firm that specializes in distressed resource assets. When Bolivia's state lithium company collapses under the weight of canceled contracts and political chaos, Victoria's firm will be there with rescue financing, terms favorable to investors, long-term extraction rights at a fraction of their previous value. By 2034, her firm's Bolivia position will be worth $800 million. The lithium that could have built a Bolivian middle class will instead build American shareholder returns. Remember what Roberto Chen said about Venezuela. The only thing we've won is the right to be blamed when it all falls apart. He was describing a pattern that's about to repeat across the entire continent. Here's the uncomfortable truth that neither Washington nor Beijing will admit: there's no scenario where Latin America wins. If America succeeds, if the Donroe Doctrine pushes China out and reasserts hemispheric dominance, Latin American countries become captive markets again, dependent on American goodwill, unable to negotiate better terms because there's no alternative. The leverage that Chinese competition created vanishes. If China adapts, if it finds ways around American pressure, builds new routes, maintains its relationships, then Latin American countries become battlegrounds. Every election contested, every government pressured, every economic decision scrutinized for signs of choosing the wrong side. Either way, sovereignty becomes fiction. Let me show you what this looks like at national scale. Imagine a timeline of Brazilian economic projections. In 2024, before Venezuela, Brazil was forecast to grow at 2.8% annually. Chinese infrastructure investment was driving expansion in the Northeast. State Grid was building transmission lines that would unlock renewable energy potential. Post-Donroe projections show something different. Growth drops to 1.9% through 2030 as companies delay investment decisions. Capital flight accelerates as wealthy Brazilians move assets to stable jurisdictions. The currency weakens. Inflation ticks up. The government, caught between American pressure and Chinese contracts, satisfies no one. Lucia Fernandez, the trade negotiator watching empires fight over her country, will spend the next decade in meetings that go nowhere. By 2034, she'll be 50 years old, burned out, watching colleagues leave for private sector jobs in Miami and Shanghai. She'll tell anyone who asks that Brazilian diplomacy used to mean something, used to command respect. Now it means finding ways to say yes to everyone while committing to no one. But there's a second twist hiding in these projections, something the Donroe Doctrine's architects are only beginning to understand. Coercion works until it doesn't, and the moment it stops working, everything changes. Colombia, America's closest ally in South America, joined China's Belt and Road Initiative in 2025. Not because Colombia loves Beijing, because Colombian businesses calculated that American pressure wasn't credible enough to risk losing Chinese markets. Argentina's Milei, supposedly the most pro-American leader in the region, is quietly maintaining Chinese contracts while publicly praising Washington. The doctrine assumes compliance. But compliance requires credibility, and credibility requires follow-through. Can America actually sanction Brazil? Can it actually punish Mexico? Can it destabilize every government that defies it? The answer is probably not, but finding out will take years. And in those years, every Latin American nation will be calculating odds, hedging bets, and watching the chaos spread. By 2034, we won't have clarity. We'll have a hemisphere paralyzed by uncertainty, a generation of development lost to great power competition, and 100 million people whose futures were traded away in negotiations they never knew happened. That's the cost of the Donroe Doctrine. Not war, not invasion. Something quieter and more permanent. The slow death of a continent's potential. And it's already begun. Let me bring you back to where we started. Not the helicopters, not the handcuffs. The question underneath all of it. How does the most powerful nation on Earth lose control of its own backyard without firing a single shot? We've spent the last hour watching that question unfold across decades and continents. Chinese shipping containers stacking up in Peruvian ports. Power lines stretching across Brazil under Beijing's control. Lithium deals signed in Bolivia while Washington wasn't paying attention. And now, the violent reassertion of American dominance in Venezuela as proof of concept, with the entire hemisphere watching to see what comes next. But here's what I need you to understand before we finish. This isn't a story with a clear ending. We're not at the resolution. We're at the inflection point. The moment when patterns that have been building for 20 years finally become visible to everyone. Let me show you what those patterns look like right now in 2025. Picture a world map with trade flows animated across it. Red lines for Chinese commerce, blue for American. In 2000, the Western Hemisphere was almost entirely blue. By 2015, red lines started appearing in South America. By 2025, it looks like a circulatory system with two hearts pumping blood in different directions. Neither dominant. Both essential. Both increasingly incompatible. That's the world the Donroe Doctrine is trying to reshape through force. And that's why this moment matters more than any single military operation. I called Roberto Chen last week, the port logistics coordinator who watched those autonomous Chinese cranes in Peru and realized America had already lost. He's 71 now, retired to a small house in San Diego, but he still tracks the shipping data. Old habits. When I asked him what he sees coming, he was quiet for a long moment. "You know what keeps me up at night," he said. "It's not that America might lose. It's that we've forgotten how to win without destroying things. The Chinese built ports. We arrested a president. The Chinese laid power lines. We issued sanctions. Somewhere along the way we forgot that influence is something you earn, not something you demand." Roberto's observation cuts to the heart of what we've been examining. The Donroe Doctrine assumes that coercion can reverse 2 decades of infrastructure and investment, that Latin American countries will choose American threats over Chinese partnerships. That sovereignty means nothing when Washington decides it means nothing. But what if that assumption is wrong? Remember Gabriela Quispe, the school teacher in Uyuni, whose classroom was built with Chinese money. I reached her through a colleague 2 days ago. The school is still open for now. But enrollment is down. Families are leaving the region because the lithium contracts are frozen. The road to her village, the one Chinese investment paved, is already starting to crack. No one is maintaining it. They told us development was coming, she said. First the Chinese said it. Then the Americans said it. Now no one is saying anything. They're just fighting over who gets to take what's underneath our feet. And we're supposed to be grateful that anyone notices we exist. That's not cynicism. That's clarity. The clarity that comes from watching empires make promises they never intended to keep. Here's the contrarian point that most analysis misses. The Donroe Doctrine might fail, not because China outmaneuvers America, but because Latin America simply stops believing either side. Nationalism is rising across the hemisphere. Not left-wing nationalism, not right-wing nationalism. Something harder to categorize, a rejection of external control that doesn't care which flag is doing the controlling. Mexico's resistance to American pressure isn't ideological, it's practical. Brazil's hedging isn't pro-China, it's pro-Brazil. The assumption that Latin American countries must choose between Washington and Beijing ignores a third option, choosing themselves. And that's the twist hiding in plain sight. The more America pressures, the more it pushes countries toward that third option. The more China invests, the more it creates dependencies that generate resentment. Both superpowers are building the conditions for their own exclusion. Maria Santos understood this before most analysts did, the Sao Paulo engineer whose salary comes from Beijing. When I spoke with her for this video, she said something that reframed everything. Americans think we love China. Chinese think we need them. Both are wrong. We tolerate whoever builds things. The moment someone offers us a better deal, a deal that doesn't come with conditions or threats, we'll take it. Every country here would. We're not loyal. We're practical. And right now, no one is offering what we actually want. What Latin America actually wants is agency. The ability to develop on its own terms, to sell resources to the highest bidder without being labeled an enemy, to build infrastructure without becoming a debt colony, to exist in a world where geography isn't destiny. The Donroe Doctrine offers the opposite. It offers a return to the Monroe Doctrine, updated, rebranded, but fundamentally the same. The Western Hemisphere as American property. Sovereignty as a privilege granted by Washington. Choices limited to compliance or consequences. That's the framework I want to leave you with. Not predictions, not financial advice. Just 3 questions to ask as this story continues to unfold. First, who benefits from the chaos? When markets swing wildly, when governments fall, when economies fragment, follow the money. The answer usually isn't nations. It's the institutions positioned to profit from instability. Second, what's the gap between public narrative and actual policy? When officials talk about democracy and freedom, look at what they're actually doing. Look at who they're supporting. Look at what they're demanding in return. Third, who pays the cost? Not in press releases, not in GDP statistics, in actual human lives. Elena losing her mining job in Chile. Juan watching his village's future collapse. Gabriela teaching children in a school that might not exist next year. Those costs are always real. They're always borne by people far from the rooms where decisions are made. And they're always justified by abstractions, security, stability, national interest, that somehow never translate into better lives for the people doing the suffering. Let me bring this full circle. Remember what I said at the beginning. What happened in Venezuela wasn't about Maduro or drugs. It was the opening shot of something much larger. Now you've seen what that larger thing is. 2 empires fighting over a hemisphere, trillions of dollars in resources at stake, hundreds of millions of lives hanging in the balance, and a doctrine that says the rules no longer apply, Not international law, not sovereignty, not the basic principle that countries can choose their own partners. The story isn't over. It's barely begun. The next decade will determine whether Latin America emerges as a battleground or finds a way to chart its own course. Whether American coercion succeeds or accelerates the very thing it's trying to prevent. Whether China adapts or retreats. Whether the world order that emerged after World War II survives or fragments into something older and more dangerous. I don't know how it ends. Nobody does. But I know this: empires that forget how to build eventually forget how to last. And somewhere in Caracas, in a country now under American supervision, the ghost of the Monroe Doctrine has risen with a new name. It's hungry, and it's just getting started.